This is a tutorial on the political society and culture and identity within the European Union, which of course is a bit of a tricky subject matter because the European Union is not a country, it's not a confederation, certainly not a federation, certainly not a nation state. It's a union of 28 member countries. So to speak of one coherent political culture becomes really quite challenging. Again, this number is incorrect, should say 28 states. 500 million people, the GDP is about equal to the United States today. It's really the best and most entrenched example of regional integration today. There are other examples of regional integration in the world, NAFTA, other examples of regional bodies of governance like APEC and so on, but none of them are as complex, none are as deeply entrenched as the European Union. And in this sense, it's also the world's most successful and powerful international organization. It certainly has a lot more power over the member states than, say, the United Nations has, and a lot more power to implement policy over the member states than the United Nations has. However, it also has entered a period of prolonged stagnation and great economic difficulties. And this is, of course, probably the most formidable challenge it has ever encountered as body of governance. The resilience of this body of governance, this model of governance, is currently being tested. We'll see how well it withstands these challenges. I'm going to go over a series of different topics associated with the European Union, and I'll start with belonging. What is it like to be a citizen of the European Union? It has all the trappings of a country. It has the symbols of a country. It has its own flag. It has capital cities, cities with a plural, because of course the EU institutions are divided between Brussels and Strasbourg and Frankfurt. So there's a number of European cities that have central functions EU complex. It has a currency, it has an anthem, and so on. So there is all these symbols of countryhood are there. But do individuals in Europe feel more attachment to the EU or to their member country? This is going to depend greatly on where you are in the European Union and when you are in the European Union. So, for instance, traditionally, the British and Swedish populations have been very, very skeptical towards the European Union, while Irish and Italians have been much more enthusiastic. Now, this enthusiasm that was historically there, certainly during the 1990s and at least up until 2005 and so on, is currently on the challenge because of the economic hardships. But even with that, there is a varying degree of enthusiasm towards the European Union depending on which country you're in. Question that keeps being raised, certainly by nationalist politicians in the member states, concerns the EU as a threat to the national identity of the member states and the political communities that they represent. And the evidence here is really that so far there seems to be very little um, displacement of national identity as a result of the European Union. There is little widespread identification with Europe among Europeans. Partisan life remains exclusively national, and by that I mean when you get engaged in a political party and when you get engaged with the politics, the political dialogue in public space, the vehicle for that is still the national political parties. There is no European-wide political party, even though you will have in the European Parliament, for instance, you will have liberals from Germany and Sweden and Great Britain. They will work together in the European Parliament, in the parliamentary alliance created for that purpose in that body of governance. But when these parliamentarians of the European Parliament go back to their country of origin, they're still speaking within the national party that they have been elected from. And the same thing goes for interest groups. They're also nationally oriented. So the nation state, the state, the sovereign state is still the primary vehicle, the primary arena for political involvement and conversation within the European Union. and there's just a lack of intensive public involvement in the European Union. And a final matter when it comes to belonging is, of course, to define exactly who theoretically should be a part of the European Union in terms of identity and who shouldn't. In other words, where does Europe end? Of course, the flashpoint of this currently is the discussion on the membership negotiations of Turkey, that at least partially has territory on what could traditionally be considered European, the European continent, uh, but of course also stretches into Minor Asia and Anatolia, which might not be part of the European continent. How about the Ukraine? Or what about Georgia and the Caucasus? Where do we draw the line for where Europe ends? This has never been established in any of the treaties that make up the framework of the European Union, has never been defined, and will likely have to be so eventually, although it's not an immediate issue. It is an immediate issue in the sense of Turkey's negotiation for entry to the EU, but some of the reasons, at least, why this negotiation is taking a long time is because, of course, uh, the democratic system within Turkey, which might not meet all the criteria and demands and conditions that the European Union poses on applicant countries before admittance. Part of that, of course, is related to how the Turkish state is treating minorities, specifically, of course, the Kurds, and the minority rights and absence of minority rights within Turkey at the present stage. But if Turkey were to solve all those matters tomorrow, I think that there would still be some governments that would be opposed to Turkey joining the EU simply because of it being a Muslim majority country. France certainly have signaled under France under Sarkozy certainly signaled precisely this. Linking to all this is really a debate on the media. As I mentioned about all the other vehicles for political expression like interest groups or political parties, the media also remains national. It has been part of the nation state project to make public media for the nation so that we all have something to identify with and can identify together as this imagined community of the nation tied together by all sorts of different infrastructures, including mass media. And thus it remains in Europe. There is no single European vehicle for media, unless you count Eurosport, I guess. The point being, there's little news coverage of EU and its politics. There is no vehicle for a pan-European media discussion. And one of the reasons here, one of the barriers for creating this, aside from the fact that there's probably no single member state that would want to contribute to that, even though the EU might want to, is the language gap. Every national language is officially recognized within the European Union as an equal language. So Swedish is an official language recognized within the European Union. So is Danish. So is French, Italian, and so on and so forth. So you have 28 countries with at least that many languages. And how do you create a media outlet in 28 languages that integrates the interests and responds to the interests of all citizens from the Arctic Circle in the north to the Atlantic Portuguese coast and the Greek Mediterranean coast? That's a formidable challenge indeed. And also you have the voting rates that are lower than for national elections. There is simply, because of all these barriers to creating this common public space in the European Union, an alienation from EU politics. And politics in that sense remained very much based on the national arena. Free movement is another really, really important trait of the European Union. It's a key cornerstone of the European Union. Anyone who is a European citizen can move to any country, do not need to apply for work permit. That's automatic, at least in theory. There has been some qualifications for the new ascending countries such as Romania and Bulgaria, and of course during the expansion in 2005, there were some countries that had limitations on migratory flows from the newly entering Eastern European countries. But even with those barriers, they are only temporary and over time has been historically phased out. So that's something that can be expected for Romania and Bulgaria as well. Free movement is really a cornerstone here. So you can go as a German, you can go work in France or Portugal. You can as a as an English citizen, you can retire in Portugal or Italy, and so on and so forth. But how many have actually used this free movement? Well, there is a series of different streams of internal EU migrants. The first wave was really the one back in the 1950s and 60s, where you really had a labor force movement from the south to the north to the industries that were building up after the war. This was Italians, Greeks, and so on moving to France and Germany, and for the purpose of working in the developing industries in the 50s and 60s. So that was the first wave. And then if we fast forward a bit, you had the institution of EU scholarships that have encouraged youth to study at universities abroad. Now this is with a reservation for the potential language barrier, but aside from that, it's entirely possible for a young person of university age to go from Finland to study in France or Italy. And there are many of EU scholarships that would support this. And of course, when that has been done, when that educational program is done, there has been a group of young urban professionals graduated from these universities that find work all across the EU and is a quite mobile demographic. And then there are the love migrants, people who are working somewhere and they meet someone and there is attachment and there is partnership, and then they move somewhere else and bring their spouses with them. So this is a person who's moving because their partner has a job abroad and they go with them. A fifth category of migrants has been developing in later years: seniors, baby boomers that are retiring, who are migrating from the north to the south. You'll find the target countries here being Italy, Spain, Portugal, for instance. And then there is the new wave of laborers going from the newly acceded Eastern European countries to the West. Many of these, this was particularly true in 2005, just after accession, when economic times were also fairly good. After the recession started, some of these at least, moved back to the East, because if you look at where the growth rates are today in the European Union, it's primarily in some of the Baltic countries as well as in Poland. So you will find that laborers will follow these economic trends and move where growth is. But even with all these 6 different waves, most Europeans simply never migrate. So the impact for the larger population of Europeans have more been, it's an easier time to travel across Europe if you're a tourist, but in terms of actually moving and for purpose of more permanent migration, most Europeans haven't actually used these opportunities. And even if you do move, this might not actually manifest as changed identification for the migrant in terms of loyalty to the EU, identifying with the EU, or as a European. There are in fact 4 classic reactions. One is that you go native in the new country, in the host society that you've gone to. So a person moving from Spain to the United Kingdom might start identifying as British. Another is remaining loyal to the country of origin. That same person rejecting the United Kingdom and the sense of belonging there and remaining stalwartly Spanish in identity. The third is actually feeling European. And feeling that, oh, I'm beyond the nation state identification, I'm now a citizen of Europe. So that is one permutation. And then of course there's the possibility that the person ends up feeling alienated from everything. So it's this issue of free movement is much more complex than maybe the original architects of free movement envisioned. And this is a overview of the complexities of creating and the growth of a political culture and identity within the European Union. I hope that was useful.